Hello and welcome. This BPAL signature event is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We'll be talking with Professor Howard Gardner. Nick and Howard, you can take it away.
My name is Nick Wilson. I'm the Director of Teaching Innovation at the Harvard Initiative for Learning and Teaching. And thank you again for joining us this afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here with Professor Howard Gardner to talk about Project Zero and 55 years of work. Now, of course, Dr. Gardner is best known in educational circles for his theory on multiple intelligences, which is a critique of the notion that there exists just a single human intelligence that can be assessed with standard psychometric instruments and measurements. But today, of course, he's here to talk with just about Project Zero, which is celebrating its 55th anniversary. So Howard, welcome.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks to VPAL for having me on today.
Yeah, of course, of course. So let's start by having you tell us a little bit about Project Zero. So what is Project Zero exactly?
There are lots of research centers around Harvard. They look at ethics, they look at computers and AI, they look at early childhood. Project Zero stands out because even though we've been around for over half a century, the name doesn't reveal anything. And in fact, at one point, in an effort to try to help us raise money, the ed school said, well, why don't you give it a more substantive name? And I was kind of surprised and secretly pleased that people overwhelmingly said, no, we want to remain Project Zero. So obviously that reveals nothing about what it is that we do, but I'm happy to both unpack the name and talk a bit about what we're up to.
Yeah, no, that would be great. So I think we'd love to hear about sort of how that got started and how did the name Project Zero come about?
Sure. In the middle 60s, there was a professor, a philosophy professor named Nelson Goodman. He was an epistemologist interested in the nature of knowledge, but he became interested in the arts and in fact wrote a book called Languages of Art. He was also an impresario. He liked to put on lecture performances in the arts. And in his book, Languages of Art, which we used to call the Bible, he said there's lots of lore about artistic education, but there's almost no systematic knowledge. You can't really say what's the best way to make someone into a good painter or an audience member for a concert and so on. So he said, I'd like to start a research project at the ed school called Project Zero. This was in 1967, a long time ago. And as it happened, two individuals, a man named David Perkins was finishing his doctorate at MIT in artificial intelligence. And I was finishing my doctorate at the Department of Psychology in developmental psychology. And we became the first research assistants at Project Zero. I'd like to quit, we weren't paid anything, and that's a long-standing tradition, but in fact, people do get paid now. And in the early 70s, and Goodman retired, and he said, well, if you guys want to run Project Zero, you may. And we did for 28 years. Since then, there have been, I believe, 5 or 6 leadership changes. It's been smooth. As far as I know, we've never had any scandals. And we go about doing our work. And of course, for the rest of the hour, I'll try to talk about what that work is.
Oh, great. Yeah, no, I'm very excited to hear more about that. Now, it strikes me 55 years is just an incredibly long run for any kind of research center. And so this being the 55th anniversary, that seems like that's quite unusual. Is that true? Or, can you say more about that?
Well, especially given our name, that's how much money we have in endowment. And, Project Zero got its name because Goodman said we don't know anything systematic about arts education. We're really starting at zero. But while we began in arts education, we're quite broadly oriented now. We work in many different areas of education. We study creativity, we study ethics. As you mentioned, we study intelligence. We study the nature of understanding. We do a lot of work in the digital realm. And the way I describe Project Zero, and I want to emphasize, if you had somebody on other than me, they might well describe it in a different way. I say, we do research on ideas in education, and we give it a push in the right direction. And by that, I mean, we don't run schools, we don't run museums, we don't run businesses, we don't do startups, but
Mm-hmm.
all those entities come to us, schools from all over the world, museums and other artistic organizations from all over the world, increasingly parts of the government or parts of businesses come to us and say, we're interested in one of the issues I mentioned, understanding, intelligence, creativity, ethics. Can you help us? And then we work together with them. And we are primarily scholars. So we teach. We have many different kinds of meetings where people can sign up and take courses with us. We hold a summer institute for several hundred people from all over the world. We write books. I brought three of them with me, but I would say Project Zero has written well over 100 books. I've been people at Project Zero in the last 55 plus years, thousands of articles. We give talks, and that way we're very much like another research center at Harvard. But without an endowment, we have to be on our toes. We have to use our wits. We have to raise money. And possibly the most amazing thing about Project Zero is that many of us have spent our whole lives there. Project Zero is filled with people who came in as research assistants, as Dave Perkins and I did. I could name 20 others, and many people have really spent their lives. Daniel Wilson, the current head, and I both met our wives at Project Zero. That's not it's not a requirement, a romance. But there's something about the culture, something about the air. And what I would have said some years ago, it tends to attract people who are interested in the arts. Many people are writers or musicians or actors or visual artists, but they like to think rigorously about it. When people say creativity, some people say, oh my goodness, don't try to dissect it. To dissect it will be to destroy it. And we say, on the contrary, it's good to understand creativity, particularly if you want to help people be more creative and less hung up. And similarly with some of the other things we look at, intelligence, ethics, digital life, we like probing about it, and many of us do it through the arts, but many of us do it through other lenses.
So I can imagine that framing around arts education is something that sort of permeates or influences a lot of the different directions of all the different projects over the years that folks have done and been a part of. You know, one of the things that is sort of striking to me is that even though that Project Zero may have started around arts education, like you mentioned, it spans discipline, formal and informal learning environments. It seems like really Project Zero sort of is covering sort of a massive scope of work around not just education, but learning sort of in general. Is that accurate to say?
What I like to say is, for something to be studied at Project Zero, it has only two requirements. One is you're really interested in it, and two, you can raise money for it. If you're not interested in it, I'm sure most people who are watching are researchers of one sort or another. It's ghastly to have to do research on something you're not interested in, but you may not be able to raise money for it. At one time, we did an account, and I'd written out 300 letters of inquiry to foundations. About 100 of them were even answered. And then Ellen Winter, my wife, created a file called Ray of Hope. And these were foundations where we didn't get a strict no, but rather an opportunity to try to make our case. And sometimes the projects go on for many years, and sometimes they're rather short-lived. And of course, they don't all work. I hope they don't go back to zero, but some of our hunches don't pan out. And some of them lead in ways that one could never have anticipated. In fact, I did bring along 3 books as props, and I'm going to try to hold them up. This is a book called Studio Thinking. And let me tell you about its origin, because I think it's really quite fascinating. Given our interest in arts education, we're very interested in the claims, which are universal, and probably most people watching this will believe them. The claims are that if you study arts, it makes you better in academics. And I don't think we ever had anybody head of the National Endowment of the Arts or running a museum or a music group who doesn't say that. However, when Ellen Winter and Lois Hetland and Shirley Venema and Kim Sheridan did a meta-analysis of all the studies which had claimed that the arts make you better students. The claim didn't hold up. And that caused a lot of anger in the arts ed community because we'd like to be able to make this claim, but if the claim doesn't stand up to scrutiny, then it's bogus. So what they did after the study is they spent a lot of time in arts classes, particularly in visual arts classes, to try to study what it is that students actually do learn. And in studio thinking, they list 8 habits of the mind. See which ones I can remember. The ability to envision, learning a craft, persisting, imagining. And here's the one I like best, because it's not one that I would have thought about, but anybody who's watching, I think, would see that it makes a connection. You learn how to give and take critique. One thing in schools in this country and elsewhere is people are very reluctant to criticize or to take criticism, and that's bad because you don't learn without criticism. But of course, you can't do the arts with an art teacher saying this works or what are you trying to achieve and getting critique. So if you take an arts course, you shouldn't assume that your SAT is going to go up. In fact, if it does, it's probably because in your school, a lot of people take the arts, but they also take foreign languages and other things. It's an upscale kind of school. But if you learn about how to critique, there's no reason in the world why that shouldn't be obtaining to how you do your work in other areas, what you're like at the workplace. So having demolished the spurious claim that the arts raise your SAT, we instead have a set of things where it's reasonable to improve, that you would improve across the academic board. And that's a nice example of work at Project Zero, which I'm very proud of. And I had nothing to do with the actual study except being married to one of the authors.
No, it's wonderful. And as I think you introduced those, right, as 8 sort of different sort of like either dispositions or habits of mind. It sounded like, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm sorry, I'm also distracted by my cat here, Barnaby, who decided to join us. And I'm just thinking, I know over the past several years, especially that this sort of idea of transdisciplinary skill has become so important as people are thinking about what is sort of high impact for people who are, not just in higher education, but for children, for adolescents, developing some of these different sort of transdisciplinary skills or different habits of minds is sort of critical. It's sort of fascinating that this has come out of some of the work around arts education. I think maybe that sort of points to really one of the strengths of, or the importance, right, of having arts sort of in the curriculum.
Sure, but what the authors would say, because they've said it to me, it's very different when you study the arts for the art's sake, for learning arts, and you pick up other skills. But if you use art only instrumentally, I'll use music, for example. Let's say you teach music only so people understand how to keep time, and that might help you some in a mathematics class. You may as well teach it in math. So you shouldn't, this is very Nelson Goodman-like, you shouldn't violate what's central to the arts just because you want to raise some other kind of performance. But we're very, very interested in interdisciplinary work. We've been looking at it for well over 2 decades. Somebody who I think is watching, Veronica Boix-Mancia, led that investigation. And my own interest now is in the nature of synthesis, what it means to take lots of information from lots of different sources and putting it together. And the interest comes in part because that's one of the few things I'm good at, but also in this era of chat GPT, where so much synthesis is being done by computational algorithms, we really have to sharpen our thinking about why we're synthesizing, what the purpose of it is, and what aspects of synthesis are fine to give to an algorithm, and which ones, for example, ethical ones, which we should be very leery of basically downloading onto some kind of a computer application.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to steer us back a little bit towards Project Zero for just a moment. There was an interesting question that came in through the Q&A, and I thought that might be a good time to ask before we go into some of the individual projects that you wanted to mention. And the question from an anonymous attendee is, how does Project Zero differentiate itself from other K through 12 professional learning providers and maintain relevancy? This is actually a great part of the question. How does it maintain relevancy in the field? Again, going back to the fact that it's been around for 55 years, that's really incredible.
Okay, well, that's a nice question. And since we're called Zero, it's appropriate that somebody calls themselves anonymous. We won't be revealing anything. Well, I think that people who come to Project Zero and like it and stay are by their very nature imaginative, original, creative. We don't like doing the same kind of thing. We like to build on what it is that we've done before, but take it in a somewhat new direction. And then sometimes interesting things occur. One of my students from many years ago is a Singaporean, and he came to us a couple of years ago and he said, I'm interested in work that's going on at Project Zero. He knew some of it because we're trying in Singapore to help people prepare for the changing work environment. And everybody knows that even before the pandemic, how the working environment is changing. And I just mentioned ChatGPT. We do a lot of work abroad. We haven't ever focused on the changing nature of work. But when Kevin approached us, we said, well, there's two projects at Project Zero. One is called Lila. It's a learning initiative for people who run organizations. And the other is called Good Work. It's what's the nature of work. And that's something we've been working on for 25 years. So we used this invitation from Singapore, an Institute of Management there, to try to bring together the Lila ideas about unlearning, what it means to unlearn something, which is obviously crucial if you're doing something new, and what it means to have good work, which is work that's done well, done in an ethical way, and personally engaging. So we hope and believe we were useful to the Employment Center at Singapore, but we also, shall we say, did some work of our own of interweaving, transdisciplinary, if you will, and whatever happens with Singapore, we're probably going to try to give this ideas to working entities in the United States. So that's just one example. It wasn't one I prepared for. It just popped up from your question. I think probably the Project Zero website is already available in the chat. And
just put it up there.
I would say conservatively, we've had over 200 projects at Project Zero in the 55 plus years. And some of them, as I said, were short-lived. Many of them could not have been anticipated 2 years before. Coming together of what we're interested in, what we read in the news, and the opportunity to get some funding. And because it's too difficult to carry research if you don't have an income.
Right. So it's an entirely soft money organization.
Yeah, not by choice. If anybody's listening and wants to endow us, we'd be very happy. Actually, one foundation has been generous. This is the Zantz Charitable Foundation in giving us money, which we can use to bring in students who couldn't otherwise afford Project Zero seminars, which can summer institutes, which can run thousands of dollars, and also to diversify both the leadership and the students. And that's kind of a wasting endowment, means we don't have to spend it right away, but we're not going to just wait till Harvard gives its 4.5% interest, because that would take a long time to fund us. But I think to have an endowment, either you need to have somebody who says, I want to start something. And if you read the newspapers, universities are filled with people who want to start something and put their name on it. Or if there is a board of directors which spends a lot of time trying to raise funds and has people on it with deep pockets. And speaking honestly, until now, the leadership has not wanted to spend time doing that. We run the risk of dying. On the other hand, I'm very ambivalent, this is getting into my own psyche, about the advantages and disadvantages of having a generous endowment. Obviously, if you have a generous endowment, you don't have to seek funds, but you might also get lazy and fat, so to speak. And having to hustle, it isn't something I would recommend unless you have kind of a daring personality. But I think our work in a sense, because we've had to hustle, has a kind of an edge, which it might not have if every year we had a few $1 million to spend.
Right.
Also, going back to the question you asked, which I don't totally remember, there are many for-profit places that do what we do. Many businesses, go out and sell products, curricula, exams, and so on. They're run on the profit motive, which we don't do. And then there are places which are endowed to focus just on adolescence, or focus just on dyslexia. And of course, they can be imaginative, but if you're dyslexia, you can't look at the workplace in Singapore.
Right, exactly.
So we have that kind of freedom. Maybe zero is a kind of freedom in a certain way. It's 2 zeros are infinity.
I think that's actually, in a way, to go sort of back to sort of almost the beginning of our conversation. So the things that I'm hearing, right, are that one, there's an advantage in not being an endowed organization and being on some money, because it allows you to be nimble. In fact, you have, like, to your point, right, you've got to be nimble to be able to sort of seek out additional sources of funding. But it sounds also, right, that the scope of all the different projects that Project Zero has been a part of has been so vast and so wide. I'm wondering, are there sort of like a core set of either like principles or values that sort of help you decide what kind of projects you want to take up? I'm sure there's lots of people that are coming to Project Zero and asking for your collaboration or for your assistance with something. Is there sort of like a guiding light for you all?
The way the Project Zero is organized is that we have research assistants, we have project managers, and we have principal investigators, which is a Harvard term for people who have the right to raise funds. And if you have an idea and you're not a principal investigator yourself, you need to find somebody who will sponsor the project. And there's almost always a cultivation process first within Project Zero. Is this something we're interested in? Is this something we can do? Who would be the people who would do it? Who's coming off soft money and needs to have a job? Who's got too much money and needs to have a new assistant? And then there's almost always a conversation with the funder. When I say we haven't had scandals, and I hope that isn't disproved in the next 20 minutes, there's some times where I've said, I'm not going to take this money. And there are 2 cases where I have actually terminated it because it was clear to me that the funder wanted only certain answers. Whenever I see a Harvard naming thing that comes out, and everybody who's watching probably knows that, and I say, what's the cost of doing something with this person's name on it, and will you regret it? And there's probably some difference within Project Zero in this, but I'm a rather strict constructionist about what I would accept money for. But I've had good experiences in talking with 95% of funders, including one now where we have a big grant, say, it hasn't worked out exactly the way we thought. We'd like to try something instead. Is that okay with you? And I think if funders didn't just want us to come up with a certain answer, in which case they didn't have to fund us, or just make them famous, which we're not going to do in any case, that conversation can be extremely instructive. And I think I've done this. I would dedicate books to people who have funded us and who have learned together with us. That's, to me, the ideal setup. And American philanthropy has been, on balance, very good about that. Many countries, they don't have a tradition of philanthropy. I think almost everybody has in mind countries and people for whom they wouldn't take funding. But there's still a lot of opportunity for the entrepreneurial spirit. And you would not want to work at Project Zero if you didn't have an entrepreneurial spirit.
Right. Thank you for that. Thank you for that response. So now I'm sure people are really interested in hearing about some of the different projects. And I know I'm pretty sure there's a number of projects listed on the website, right?
Too many.
Too many.
Yes, no, we've done hundreds of projects. And I should mention that, hi there, haven't seen your cat tell me off. Ellen Winter, I mentioned, who's worked at Project Zero for only 50 years, is actually doing a study of the impact of Project Zero. Because, of course, we can make all sorts of claims, but that's different from actually going out into the field and talking to people who've used our ideas. And that's a 3-year project, which has just begun. And we'll know a lot more about not just impact of Project Zero, because Project Zero is one of many, many research entities, but in general, how to assess impact. I mean, I'll use myself here as an example. Probably multiple intelligences is one of the best ideas that Project Zero has developed as far as becoming viral. Everybody knows about emotional intelligence, social intelligence, but it's in fact extremely difficult to document what real effect it has had. That's probably going to be my job rather than Ellen Winter's job, but we could say this about many, many different projects. But I brought along two other exhibits. This is a case, actually, my wife was just reminding me of that, of a case where a foundation actually came to us, as the Spencer Foundation, which is the largest foundation that funds educational research in America. And they said, there's lots of talk now about understanding and the importance of understanding. I guess nobody's against understanding, but we would like you to put together a project to help us understand what understanding is. And so for 10 years, Dave Perkins and I and many, many other people, Stone Weisky among them, tried to understand what understanding is. And given that it takes 10 years, I can't describe it in 10 seconds, but I'll give you some of our thinking. Understanding sounds like something that occurs inside the head, inside the brain. And of course, it's good to have a head and a brain. But we came to the conclusion understanding is a performance. And if you understand something, you're able to perform in certain ways. And we can't even think about performance, about understanding, unless we say, what are the performances of understanding that are taking place? And how do we assess somebody is really understanding? So an example I came up with just today is, let's say you study revolution, and you study the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution and the American Revolution. Anybody who studied that can sort of spit back what they learn about what happened in 1776 or in 1789 or 1917. But if you understand revolution, you can perform that understanding with new items. So let's say I were to show you a photograph of Tiananmen Square in 1989, June of 1989, when students are protesting the communist regime. Is that a revolution? Or, to bring up something a little bit more controversial, if I show you a video of January 6th, 2021, around the Capitol, is that a revolution? And you can't really look that up. You certainly can't look it up in China, because you can't even mention Tiananmen Square in China. But somebody who can perform an understanding can take what they know about the revolutions in Russia and in United States and in France, and they can speak, they can write plausibly about whether those examples are or aren't revolution. Another thing that's been done by other people at Project Zero, Ron Richard and Shari Tishman, is to create thinking routines. And thinking routines are things which help people go beyond progressive education to be rigorously progressive. So if we were to show people the photograph of Tiananmen or of the Capitol, a thinking routine is see, think, and wonder. And this is something that teachers imbibe, and they share it with the students. So first of all, what do you see at the Capitol? What do you see in Tiananmen? What does it make you think of? Presumably, you're going to think about how it's similar or different to what happened in the Bastille in July of '89. And then wonder, which is very Project Zero kind of work, where just like awe. Well, does this make me think different about revolution? How is it like evolution? You ask for about interdisciplinary. Does what happened to human beings, is that revolutionary or evolutionary? And then when ChatGPT emerges and Elon Musk says it's dangerous, is he worrying that it's going to be revolutionary rather than evolutionary? And if you have a class which does disciplined or rigorous progressive education, you don't just say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. You try to figure out, what do you want the understanding to be? What's the performance of understanding? And then you assess, we use the term ongoing assessment. How are the students doing in their understanding or their misunderstanding of revolution? And misunderstanding is fine. because one of the ways to help you understand is to think about the ways in which it doesn't work.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. That was great. And you brought one more book as well. I don't know if you
Yes,
wanted to mention that as well.
this is a book that's close to home because it's the most recent book that I worked on. Wendy Fishman has been my colleague for 27 years, half of Project Zero, I guess, life. And I did a very big study of colleges, a 10-year study of colleges. And we wrote a book called The Real World of College, What Higher Education Is and What It Can Be. And we studied 10 different schools, not Harvard, but schools, 9 of which called themselves liberal arts schools, one of which called itself a general school. We interviewed 2,000 individuals, 1,000 students, and a smaller number of faculty, administrators, trustees, alums, parents, and job recruiters. And the students were half freshmen and half graduating students. So 2,000 students, a lot of data. It was all transcribed. I read all of them, as did Wendy. And then we spent 2.5 years trying to make sense of that. And if I can remember, I'll tell you 4 things. One, mental health was the biggest problem in 2012, just as it is today. So even though we're discovering the huge number of mental health issues today, it was the biggest issue 10 years ago. It just wasn't as visible. Also, this is disappointing. Cheating was not considered to be a concern in general, even though cheating is rampant. And of course, with ChatGPT, it's going to be a pandemic of cheating.
Sure.
But let me mention 3 other things. One is we discovered 4 different approaches to higher education. We call them mental models. One is inertial. Well, I went to high school, so now I'm going to go to college. That didn't come up very often. One we call transactional. It's the most dominant mental model, and it grows between freshman and senior year. So, and this will be a surprise to nobody. It says, I'm going to college to get a job, and if I get a job and it's a good job, it's succeeded, and if I don't, it's a failure. And this is certainly understandable. I've got 5 grandchildren and 4 kids, but what doesn't have nearly as much support is the kind of thing which every college bulletin talks about: exploratory, learning new things, the possibility of transformation, thinking about things in a different kind of way. And alas, those wane, and that's an indictment of our higher education system. The second thing is we wanted to know what students were learning in college, but we weren't going to give them a math test or a computer test or a literary test. So we developed a concept called higher education capital. And the way to explain that is, if you were on a plane or a bus for an hour and you were talking to a college student about what's going on in their lives, movies that they've seen, their hobbies, books that they've read, etc., you would pay attention to: do they attend? Do they analyze? Do they reflect? Do they connect? And can they communicate? So see if I can remember that again. Attend, analyze, reflect, connect, and communicate. And we look to see whether between first-year students and last-year students, the higher ed cap goes up. And in some schools it does, and in some schools it doesn't. So you could well say, what's going on in college if over 4 years the kids don't get together in high ed capital? Also, you can either find this depressing or uplifting. The higher ed capital is not higher among alums. It tends to be even lower. So there is something going on in college, and higher ed capitalizes it. The other thing, which Wendy and I and a wonderful team of researchers funded by the Kern Foundation are now working on, is something that was a very upsetting result. We found that among American college students, they use the word I 11 times than they use the word we. Among other constituencies, except for faculty administrators, the ratio is 14-1. And I believe among alums, it's 22-1, 22 times as much I versus we. Now, this isn't interesting in itself. what makes it interesting, and this is where our work intersects with Robert Putnam, a great political scientist at Harvard, is America is overwhelmingly an I society. And the transactionality proves that. If it doesn't get me a good job, the time is wasted. If it does, I would just be happy to go to Google U. I don't have to go to Yale. And so we're working on an approach to try to get students beginning in their first year of college, not just to be so egocentric or so egotistical, not so much I-centered. And because we know this doesn't begin in college, we're actually looking at the I all the way back to preschool. And this is Howard's worst or best characteristic. We're looking at we in young kids. So of course we call it the we project. So this is a wonderful example of what we do at Project Zero, because when Wendy and I began this study, all we knew was that we had done some teaching and we were not happy with the description of college, which we saw in the many books that we were read, because there are many books about college and they're often good, but they're based on the example of one college or one professor's experience. We said we're going in without hypotheses. We just want to talk to lots of people, listen to what they say. The interviews were semi-structured. It wasn't we weren't following a list. We took the language where it went. So one example, we gave students, we said, well, what's the purpose of college? For those people or anybody who said to get a job, we said, and the other things were like to be broad, to learn to take care of yourself, to have friends. We said, what happens if after 3 years the job disappeared? I don't think there was one student in 1,000 who had a good answer to that. So that shows you how superficial the thinking is. And Wendy is particularly interested in the relationship between secondary school and elementary school and high school and college, because these messages start so early. There was a cartoon in the New Yorker some months ago. A mother is taking her kindergartner to school and she's saying, well, be sure to make some good contacts there and begin to network. Part of the I problem is that in the United States, people we're interested mostly in ourselves. So with Bill Kirby, our distinguished professor of Chinese history, we're doing an issue of Daedalus, which is a journal of the American Academy of Science, on innovations in higher education around the world. Because we think we have a lot to learn from many different countries. And we have 25 different authors who are going to talk about what's happening in Europe, in Hungary, in Latin America, in China, India, and so on. So maybe another way of saying we're Project Zero, where we really try to expand our purview, and we hope other people will do so as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So there was actually I think a very relevant question that came in through the Q&A, which was, so with such, and it goes back to sort of what we were just talking about with K-12 education and sort of how this idea that sort of like enculturating a sort of like an individuated sort of society or individuated sort of like, lens on education and sort of personal growth and whatnot. So the question is, with such incredible reliance on standardized testing over testing, in that it sounds to be the opinion as well, what thoughts do you have on how this impacts children's curiosity and sense of wonder? So this sort of goes back, I think, to this project you're talking about. So in designing sort of like an intervention, then, or sort of even just sort of like a pitch, why shift away from this sort of individuated approach to education? What is sort of like the takeaway? And again, how does this maybe impact children's curiosity and sense of wonder?
There are 20 questions packed into there. If you have 20 hours, no, that's a very good question. I mean, in discussing Project Zero with Ellen and others, we've come up with this notion of progressive education, which is disciplined and rigorous. Progressive education is a term that is associated with John Dewey, and its belief that people learn best when they learn with other people and when they learn about things that they care about. And that, of course, includes using your imagination. But progressive education got a bad rap because too often it turned into anything goes. Leave the kids alone, don't try to guide them in any way. And that's not realistic for most kids. So if you wanted to describe what Project Zero does, I think it follows the goals of progressive education, but it tries to give enough kind of armature and enough kind of thinking routines so that people can also learn things which they need to learn and which the society wants them to learn. But the other thing, which goes back to the very early research that I did, is there's always a pendulum between discipline and creativity. And one of the things I learned from many trips to China before Tiananmen is it's fine to start education in a disciplined way if you then loosen the constraints and make it more open, more creative. It's fine to begin with Dewey kind of progressivism if you then introduce an armature and some discipline. But if you try to do it all discipline, you take away the creativity. If it's all creative, there's no discipline. And how to titrate that, how to navigate that is really difficult, whether you're talking about first grade or whether you're talking about graduate school. And there's not one answer. I think the best answer to the questioner is there isn't one formula. Education can never be a complete science. It's always an art, because for a certain student in a certain way, they may need some more discipline. For another student, that might be just the thing that chokes them off. One wonderful thing about computers in education is we can individuate much more. So, if you're in China or indeed in the United States 50 years ago, and you have 30 or 40 kids in the class, or 50 or 60, you can't individuate now. But now we can give lessons which are much more directed at the particular learning profile. Gardner might even say that the particular intelligence profile of kids, and you can lead them into being able to do math or history or economics in a way that works for them. I always say, when a teacher teaches something and a student can't understand it, if you say to the teacher, can you teach it another way? And the teacher says no, that shows the teacher's own understanding is very tenuous. Anybody who's mastered something should be able to present it in lots of different ways. So what all of us now, everybody who's listening and watching, are thinking about it as to what extent will Chat GPT change this? I don't think anybody has the answer to that. But if you have an algorithm which can produce essays that are better than most students, that raises the ante of what we do in school. It doesn't attack the issue of I versus we, because even the most imaginative science fiction writer doesn't really believe that if you have a lot of Chat GPTs, it's the same kind of we as if you're living in Florida or Maine and trying to deal with difficult issues. That still relies on human beings. And I mentioned 2 states in America which are rather different from one another. What happens when we have to deal with China and Russia and Brazil and Hungary and, for that matter, France, Germany, England? Those are still going to be human challenges for a long time to come. And Project Zero hasn't actually solved that issue yet. The school has really changed a lot. And I've been at Harvard for now since 1961. So it's 62 years. And it has changed in many wonderful ways. But the challenges are as great as ever. And you know what they are, the listeners are, and viewers do. And part of the challenge of Project Zero and of anybody who's interested in education is that we keep thinking about these issues and we keep rethinking them, and we don't get stuck in a rut. And every week I meet with the people who work with me, and several of them are in their 20s. And that's so good for me. And I hope that in my anecdotage, I still have some help to them as well. And because so many people spend their lives at Project Zero, we have people who represent every decade. And that's probably a useful idea in education as well. When I was a student at Harvard many years ago, there were a lot more faculty who lived near the square and who spend time in the houses. And that's much less true now. And I think that's bad for everybody, but there's something I can't legislate.
Right. Yeah, I can only imagine all the incredible changes that have occurred sort of around the context of Project Zero, really, since it got started. Just as an organization, sort of with that institutional memory, things that have happened around Project Zero at Harvard and at Radcliffe. So we're nearing the top of the hour in a little bit, and there's a couple of questions left that I would love to get through. Because we've been talking so much about what Project Zero does and sort of the scope and breadth of the work. Are there things that Project Zero does not do?
Well, I knew you were going to ask me that question, so I made a list if I can find it.
Mhm.
If not, I'll just have to remember it. Yeah, there's certain things which we haven't done very much. We haven't done very much on affect,
Mhm.
emotions. It's been more cognition broadly, thinking, creativity, problem solving, understanding, but
Right.
not that much about the emotional area, the affective area, not that much about personality. Something that's been growing enormously is our interest in the digital media. That
Mhm.
began actually 20 years ago when it was just beginning, but we're starting a center now on digital thriving. It's going to be a big center, and
Mhm.
all you have to do is the same name, digital thriving, to know that's not what's happening to young people in digital life today, but it doesn't
Yeah.
mean it can't happen. So
Yeah.
that's a new kind of interest. Ethics has grown steadily.
Mm.
We began studying the nature of work many years ago. And I mentioned that in reference to Singapore, but more and more now, especially with more difficult having workplace culture because people work at home and people changing jobs so frequently. Again, Project Zero is anomalous here. How do people become ethical? Ethical being defined as learning how to deal with difficult problems where there is no set answer. And
Mhm.
so a lot of the work we're doing now, supported by the Kern Foundation and the Templeton Foundation, is about how to inculcate ways of thinking ethically, how to solve problems, how to learn to work effectively with others across different kinds of demographic and age differences. These are not things we were doing at a time where we probably thought wrongly that students were much more homogenous than they are. And there
Mhm.
was a lot of DEI interest and initiative at the School of Education, and we're fully participant in that. But not at the expense of thinking about important educational challenges which are cognitive in nature and which need to take place in any classroom and in any computer-aided instruction if we're going to have people whose minds are well-developed, disciplined, and if they're so inclined, want to be creative. I don't think you can force people to be creative. It's a big mistake, but I don't think anybody would be listening to or watching this this video cast if they weren't interested in helping people use their minds in new kinds of ways. But
Yeah.
appreciating the affective and social and emotional aspects of that is something which I certainly wasn't as sensitive to decades ago as my
Right.
colleagues have made me sensitive today.
Yeah.
I will also say what is my own personal, I almost said Captain Ahab obsession nowadays, and that is the nature of synthesizing. I mentioned it earlier, and I wrote a memoir in which I described my mind as a synthesizing mind, but my analysis is we don't really understand very much about how human beings synthesize, what it means to take in lots of information, sift it through, keep in mind what the goals are, but change the goals to the extent that needs to be done, organizing it, putting it together, testing it out,
Mhm.
first on critical friends and then friendly critics, and then letting it out. And I think the reason we know so little about synthesizing is because it's not something that you can simulate in the lab.
Yeah.
We know something about how people's memory and their attention span, because we can bring them in and do an experiment for 10 minutes.
Right.
Synthesizing takes place over months and years. I mean, the great works of synthesis, whether it's the rise and fall of the Roman Empire or the theory of evolution, these things took decades to do. And of course, we're not doing that. But even modest kind of synthesizing, what it means to write a good thesis or a good term paper, we don't know very much about that. So I've found friends and colleagues who obsess with me about this. And if anybody is listening wants to fund some work on synthesizing, we've got the troops. But I think it's an important and understood item. And because ChatGPT seems to be so good at certain kinds of synthesis, it makes it really important to understand what it is that we humans can do that maybe we don't want an algorithm to do.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thought. I was sort of going there in my mind as well, right? And from what I understand, the generative AI works in a sort of different way, but what an interesting sort of experiment, or you just thought experiment, to be thinking about modeling human cognition around that sort of like how AI does that kind of synthesis. Is anyway, that's for a different conversation, I think, at this point.
Yes, in fact, I said if 3 or 4 years from now, I make some progress in synthesis, or what I'm calling to myself the zero papers, because there's a bunch of papers about zero where we've actually talked to people who worked there and found out what they got out of it. And I wrote a history of Project Zero. It was only the first 50 years. And I mentioned that Ellen Winter is doing work on the impact of Project Zero. I'd like to put them together, and I'm open to clever titles for the zero papers for anybody who's watching or listening.
Opening call for that. That's really wonderful. All right, so I think we've got about 5 minutes left. Howard, are there any things that you would like to add that we haven't talked about yet, or haven't had a question directed at? We've got a few more questions through the Q&A tool that we can use, but
yeah, well, I think one thing, some people might be saying, I'd like to work at Project Zero, have an internship or something. And, we hire people regularly. We do not let ChatGPT or some other algorithm evaluate the applications. We do it ourselves. Many people who started Project Zero started as interns or research assistants. The best thing to do is to go to the website and read about we have about 30 projects going on now. If you find something interesting, read about it, and then contact the people on the project. I'm going to say something which I actually feel deeply about. I answer every letter I get, if it isn't clearly just a smart aleck trying to waste time and space. More and more, I get letters from people where I don't even know whether it's written by ChatGPT, or it's clear they haven't spent 5 minutes going to our website. I myself have 4 websites. So in a way which I hope is kind rather than didactic, I try to say, please read something about this. And then if you have 1 or 2 questions, send them to me. Alas, it rarely happens. But when it does, to me, that's a sign that there's a spark there. And I think that's what teachers should always do. I'll tell an anecdote, which is amusing at my expense. I knew Noam Chomsky some when I was a student, and he was a young professor. And he's, I think, without doubt, the most distinguished intellectual in the world. And he's 94, 95 years of age. I wrote something mildly critical of him in the New York Review of Books in the 1990s. He sent me a 9-page single-spaced letter showing me all the places that I was wrong. And that was a very important lesson for me. Noam tends to overdo it, but still. And also in my office is when I invited Groucho Marx to come and speak, and he said, I have to work in the hills of Beverly. It's called Making a Living. And then there was a graduate student. I wrote a paper about Piaget and Levi-Strauss, who were giants. Piaget was a psychologist. Levi-Strauss was an anthropologist. On the same day, April 10th, 1970, I received a letter from both of them. Piaget in French, Levi-Strauss in English. You cannot imagine what impact that had on a person in his 20s who was just a student. And I'm hoping that even though, people do social media and they spend lots of time chatting, that this kind of, we might say, mentorship at a distance can still occur. We should take other people seriously unless they give us reason not to, and be helpful when we can be. And if somebody's frivolous, in fact, when I wrote something recently, I said, this sounds too much like it was written by ChatGPT. I never got an answer which suggested to me that it had been.
Maybe, yeah. That's wonderful. What a great story too. Gosh, I would love to hear more about your correspondences with Piaget at some point. Howard, this has been such an incredible pleasure to have this opportunity to chat with you and to hear more about Project Zero and the work that's been coming out. So you mentioned the Project Zero website. You mentioned that you have also got a number of your own individual websites. Do you have any sort of either last words about the impact of Project Zero or things you would, a takeaway you would like for folks to leave this conversation with about Project Zero and its work?
Well, I'm going to say something that's both self-effacing and promotional.
Mhm.
I think if you walked through Harvard Yard and you ask 100 people what Project Zero was, probably nobody would know.
Mhm.
Remember once, this is a name drop, but it was completely, it's the Teddy Kennedy, the senator, asked me what Project Zero was. He said, "Is it population growth?" And I said, "What we do." But if you go to education centers around the world, they may not know about Project Zero, but our work has impact in many places, and that's of course the greatest reward. And after Ellen finishes her study, Ellen Winter, I think we'll know more about where we had impact and whether we had the right kind of impact. And I think everybody who does research at any center, whether it's named after a number or whether it tells exactly what it is that they're doing, wants to know whether they're having impact, and if so, the kind of impact they want to have. And that's why we need universities and why we need schools which do liberal arts, which don't professionalize you right away.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well said. Again, Howard Gardner, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us, and I think we're going to wrap it up. So,
Thank you, Nick. Thanks to VPAL for setting this up.
okay, cheers. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard and Nick, and thanks to all of you who have joined us today. We hope you'll join us for more signature events soon. Good night, everyone, and thank you for joining.